This is the constant struggle of being 5'1" and always being the shortest person on a panel. All right, I think I've got it. So thank you, first of all, to Ben and to the rest of my panelists for inviting me here. This is actually my first SSP, so this has been really eye-opening and really fun, actually. And Vancouver is great, too. So as Ben mentioned, I'm here to give a view from the humanities, and I will talk a little bit about who I am, where I work, some of the projects that we work on, and a few specific examples of the way that we view engagement and dissemination and impact from a primarily humanities perspective, which is sometimes a little bit different from some of the science work that we've heard about. So I'm really here to give about a 10,000-foot overview of all of this with a couple of specific examples, but if you would like to know more about any of the projects or publications that I mention, you are welcome to tweet at me or email me or ask me during the Q&A session or whatever works. Yes, it worked. So who we are. I work at the Emory Center for Digital Scholarship, which is at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. And the fact of being located in Atlanta is actually pretty important to some of the work that we do, as you'll see, I hope. I am the Digital Projects Coordinator, which, as I've told some of you, is a title that means a lot and nothing all at once. Practically speaking, what it means is that I spend about half of my time helping to foster and support and create and wrangle various scholarly and sometimes not as scholarly publications that we produce out of the center. We're more or less the library publishing arm of Emory University. Emory University doesn't have a press, but there is also some repository activity that takes place not in our office. So we're not the totality, but we are certainly kind of the journal and sometimes even digital monograph publishing arm. But we also do a number of digital scholarship projects. Not all of them are digital humanities. We are a digital scholarship center. But quite a lot of what I work on is very humanities focused because that's my background. I am almost finished with my PhD, and I am a humanist by nature and training. So that is very much the viewpoint that I come from. We at ECDS, across all of our publications and projects, are really interested in what we've come to term public-facing scholarship. Sometimes this means publications that are really geared towards, as Ben actually put it, an educated lay audience. I think that's a really nice way of putting it. Sometimes it means that we do a lot of public participatory projects. My background is in public history, so I'm actually really interested in how we make scholarship and knowledge with the public and with many publics, not just how we disseminate information to an imagined public, right? But actually making things with people is very much a part of what we do. To that end, almost everything we make is multimodal and multimedia. So that may look like having videos in journal articles. It may look like having 3D renderings in blog posts that we publish. It may look like making some of the applications that I'll talk about in a minute that are very geospatial in nature and have a lot of visualizations to them. We also very much, coming out of a library, it's probably not terribly surprising, we have a definite bias for open access and open source. Pretty much everything we create, unless there are rights issues, is openly available and freely available to the public. So what does this look like? Well, it might look something like Open Tour Builder, which is a content management system for building tours to be presented as mobile-optimized websites. That is from our GitHub page for this particular application. Basically, it just means, hey, here's a piece of software that you can use to make a tour of something. It is not an app the way that you might download from the Apple Store or the Android Store. It's a mobile-optimized website. And I think that's actually probably generally a better way to go, but I'm willing to take those arrows if you want to throw them at me later. But I have some pretty specific reasons for feeling that way. If this particular example that I have pulled up here was the very first tour that we launched with this piece of software. It can be found at battleatl.org if you're curious. And it's all about the Battle of Atlanta, which was this kind of momentous Civil War battle that took place in the city of Atlanta. And it's been completely paved over because if you've ever been to Atlanta, that's what the city tends to do. And so there's no kind of remaining battleground. There are some historical markers, but they are very heavy. You can't really pick them up and take them with you. They're really lengthy, and they're definitely written by a military historian. And if you've ever read military history, it might not be your thing. So we've really tried to, in making the content for this, make it more engaging to an audience outside of just, Civil War buffs, who are great and wonderful, and we want them to use this as well. But we didn't want them to be the only audience. Also, I think importantly here, we tried to include things about the memory of the Civil War and the way that it, continues to kind of affect U.S. politics and U.S. discourse as well. We didn't want to make it just kind of this thing that was stuck in history, but tried to say that this still very much has relevance today. So that's one kind of project that we work on that might not be what we consider traditional publishing, and it certainly doesn't look like a PDF, but it is, I think, a way to disseminate knowledge and content. It might also look like the Atlanta Studies Network, which is a project that I currently work on. And this is basically kind of half journal, half resource set, half gathering place for people interested in studying the city of Atlanta. This group, the Atlanta Studies Network, actually started as a group of people who would meet maybe quarterly in a bar, in a very famous bar in Atlanta, and give short little presentations about what they were working on or what they were interested in. And that grew into a more formal symposium. And out of that symposium, there grew this desire to really think about, well, okay, so we've got this great research and, in some cases, great student projects coming out of this type of work that aren't being published anywhere, right? I mean, it's kind of hard for most undergrads to get their research published, but often some of that work is really good and really valuable for future research. And so we decided to start not quite a journal, but something that's maybe journal-esque, as a way to also share this knowledge and hopefully continue to build a community around people interested in the city of Atlanta. Pretty tellingly, when we hold our annual symposia, we tend to get around 200 attendees, and probably a good third of those are not from academia, which, coming from a more humanities background, is pretty astounding, because you don't get a lot of, at most humanities conferences, a lot of non-academics in the audience, at least not the conferences that I go to. So people who are interested in, or people working in the nonprofit sector, people working in community mobilization, places like that, have all showed up to hang out with us, which is really, I think, really great, and shows the potential for this kind of scholarship going just beyond a PDF or a research article that won't necessarily get shared. Of course, some of what we do does look more like an academic article. This is a piece that we published a couple of months ago that is all about the housing crisis in Atlanta and the failure of the market to recover in a lot of areas. And this got a fair amount of attention from the local press too, which was really rewarding for us. The last example that I'm going to talk about is actually how I got into the world of scholarly publishing. It's a journal called Southern Spaces, which has been in existence since 2004. It is an open access journal about the real and imagined spaces and places of the US South and their global connections. So it's about the South, more or less. And the difference is, instead of being sort of purely about Southern history, everything we publish has a kind of spatial angle to it, and that can be an imagined space, right? So this is the current front page, and this is actually an article, a review of a book about kind of Appalachia and the author's imagination. So it doesn't have to be, specifically about a real place. We take that pretty broadly. But still, it's a little bit of a specialized field, right? But even within Southern Spaces, which you can visit at southernspaces.org if you're so inclined, we have seen some articles that we've published get a lot of attention and actually become part of public debate and public discourse in sometimes surprising ways. We have actually a fairly decent reach. Last year we had over 200,000 unique visitors to the site, which is not, New York Times level, but for a fairly specialized publication about the US South, it's not terrible. And that's definitely somewhat a function of the age of the journal. In terms of open access humanities publications, it's probably one of the oldest. But I think is also a function of some of the ways that we try to foster content that is really kind of public-facing and public-engaging. And the example that I'll end with here is a piece that we published back in 2013. This was written by actually a pretty famous academic who is emeritus, but is pretty well known in the field of Southern history, Dan Carter. And he wrote this in response to a lot of the cuts in education and other kind of services in the state of North Carolina that started around this time. And it is certainly, it's very much not a neutral piece. It's in some ways meant to kind of provoke. And it's really a kind of angry piece, particularly around issues of education, which is where Dr. Carter had, spent his entire career. And it got a lot of attention. In the first week, we saw over 20,000 unique visitors. It was shared over 4,000 times on Facebook. And it made its way into North Carolina radio, North Carolina news, and we're able to track all of this, through our analytics on the back end and really see the kind of reach that this piece had and indeed is still having. So I think that kind of points to the promise of humanities research. We have talked a little bit about and kind of skirted the issue of what is impact, and how you measure it is, of course, a whole nother question. But I think for a lot of humanities scholars, being part of the public debate is really what you're after. Humanities research gets, I think, devalued a lot for being very kind of cloistered and often not connected to things that seem relevant. But what we've tried to do is show, hey, actually, by publishing things that are deliberately meant to be publicly engaging, research can have a huge impact. So that is it for me, and I know we're going to take questions at the end, and I'm very excited to turn it over to talk even more about issues of public engagement and public impact. Thanks.